So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming and participating in today's speaker series on engaging diverse learners. My name is Patrice Smith, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the Strategic Integrated Planning Task Force. I am joined by my three additional co-chairs, Cindy Taylor, who is the Assistant VP of Human Resources, as well as Lorraine Dyke, who is our Deputy Provost, and Bettina Appel-Kuzmarov, who is the Clerk of Senate. So at this point, I'm pleased to invite our President and Vice Chancellor, Benoit Antoine Boucan, to introduce our speakers, as well as provide some welcome remarks for this speaker series event.
Hi everybody, thanks for being here today on such a beautiful day. Happy Halloween, appreciate the costumes, well done. Before we get started, I want to acknowledge that Carleton University is located on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin Nation. Today's event, of course, is part of our strategic planning series. I recognize the people from previous planning sessions. Thank you for caring about strategic planning. It's our last public event. I believe we've had 13 speakers overall come and speak to us on campus, giving us great ideas as to how we can elevate our game further as we write the next chapter. So today we have Sean and Heather, who I think will receive more fulsome introductions, but I do want to extend a warm welcome. Heather, and where's Sean? Where's Sean? Sean and Sean on both ends of the room. Thank you for being here with us today to speak about such an important topic, engaging diverse learners. That's great. You've heard me on this before. Planning matters in this exact sense that when you put something down and call it your plan, then over time it becomes your reality. So that's what we're doing. We're shaping our reality together. We've engaged, I think, and the co-chairs will correct me if I'm wrong, well over 600 people so far. Maybe getting close to 700, Lorraine? Can I say 800 members of our campus communities through these various events and consultation, and that's super. The dots are starting to emerge, and what's been great to see is that there is great concordance, coherence on campus as to what our values are, as to what the things that make this place great are, and the opportunities for the future. So the dots are coming out. Now the game is to try to connect them, to play pattern recognition and say, well, what is this that I see? And as this pattern emerge, our plan will coalesce into a draft. There'll be consultation on the draft, and we're, I think, on schedule for a great plan to be approved by the spring, and then we'll implement. The last thing I'll say about this is that a strategic plan is essentially a reputation plan. How can we build a roadmap that helps us to be better, obviously, but also to tell our story better and elevate our visibility and reputation. And then as your reputation rises, it helps you to be better. And these two things ratchet each other. So that's what we're doing, and that's super exciting. So I'm excited about this talk, excited about the topic, so important today, I think even more important in the future, engaging diverse learners. So thank you again, Heather and Sean, for being here. Thanks, everybody, for caring about strategic planning, and enjoy our talks.
All right, so after this, we'll have a more fulsome introduction of our speakers. But at this point, I'd like to introduce you to a new Canadian technology called QuickShare. And we're going to try to engage you in this electronic technology to collate some information from you. You'll have an opportunity later on to ask questions through QuickShare as well. So the information that we gather on QuickShare, it's hosted on a secure server. QuickShare is not an application and does not install anything on your iPhone or your other devices. It is a QR code that you can use to access the website. And if you would mind, at this point, if you have an iPhone, you could just use your camera. You may need to zoom in a bit in order to access the QR code, but please use that towards accessing a website. And you could provide information so that we could collate that information and utilize it towards developing the strategic plan, etc. So we'll be able to use the information, as I said before, and you'll be able to ask questions, etc., of our speakers today through the quick share technology. If you need help, if you have another device other than an iPhone, you could just go to the website that's presented on the screen and type in the code, and that code will get you to that website to access the technology. So at this point, there's one question that we'd like to ask. What is your role here at Carleton? So are you a faculty member, or are you a staff member, or are you a student? That just gives us an opportunity to get a sense as to who is in the room and help us to collate that information to get a sense as to who has been participating in this process so far. So, all right. So at this point, I'd like to say thank you very much for participating in that, and please keep that icon or that website open so that you can ask questions of the speakers as we go along. And if a thought comes to you during the talk, please, or the presentations, please feel free to enter that into the quick share as well. Keep in mind, however, that you can't enter a whole novel in there. It's only 5 lines, so keep the thoughts succinct and concise for those entries. At this point, I'd like to introduce my other co-chair, Cindy, who will now introduce the speakers.
Good afternoon, everyone. It is with my pleasure to introduce our guest speakers for today. I will introduce both speakers and then turn it over to them to speak. So first, I'd like to introduce Dr. Sean Lyons, who is a professor of leadership and management and associate dean, research and graduate studies at the Gordon S. Lang School of Business and Economics at the University of Guelph. Dr. Lyons' main area of research concerns intergenerational differences and their impacts on workplace dynamics and managing people. His research on generations have been featured in a number of media outlets, including Time Magazine, the Globe and Mail, the National Post, the Daily Mirror in the UK, Maclean's Magazine, as well as the CBC's The National, CTV News Channel, the Business News Network, and CBC's Radio's The Current. So I don't know where you haven't been at this point. Dr. Lyons works frequently with private and public sector organizations to identify and address intergenerational issues. Dr. Lyons will be speaking with us today about understanding today's generation of learners. Also with us is Dr. Heather Smith, who is a professor of global and international studies at the University of Northern British Columbia. She is currently on sabbatical and is a visiting scholar in the Department of Political Science at Dalhousie University. She is the recipient of the 3M National Teaching Fellowship with Canadian Political Science Excellence in Teaching Award, a 2-time recipient of the UNBC Excellence in Teaching Award, and a 2018 BC Campus Scholarly Teacher Fellow. In her most recent administration position, she was the director of the Centre for Teaching, Learning and Technology at the University of Northern British Columbia. Please join me in welcoming both speakers, and I believe, Heather, you won the toss, and you're going first.
All right, so I'm mic'd, I'm timed. I don't usually sound this great, but I have an awesome cold, so I apologize. So the territorial acknowledgement is also, have always been provided, but I'd like to make sure that we acknowledge the territory on which we are meeting. So I want to begin by acknowledging that we are on the land on which we gather is traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Nation. And I really want to give a very big thank you to Carleton for having me here today. It's always such a pleasure to come to Ottawa. I have lots of friends and family, and particularly I want to thank President Bacon for his very gracious invitation. I very much appreciate it. So we've already done the audience check-in, but I always like to get a sense of who I'm talking to. So I saw some stickies on there. Faculty? How many faculty? I have a few faculty. Awesome. Okay. Administrators? Self-identified administrators. Okay. Sometimes you don't want to self-identify as administrator. Been there, done that. Staff. Okay. Educational developers in the room. All right. Awesome. Okay. I saw Jamie in the back, so I thought I'd give you a shout out. Students, where are the students? One. And I don't mean to pick on you. It's awesome that you're here. But if there's one thing that you leave with today, it is this question, and that is, where are the students? That's the question. Because when we're talking about students, diverse learning, student engagement, teaching and learning, often the students actually aren't present in our conversations. And with that, here's my plan. I'm actually not going to talk about what I was asked to talk about. I apologize. I'm going to do my own thing, but you'll see it's with a purpose. I'm not being totally off script. So I'm not going to speak explicitly about engaging diverse learners. I'm actually going to tell you some stories and see what you take from that in terms of locations and sites of engaging with learners and students. And so it's going to seem a bit weird because it's not the usual kind of talk you might get. That's okay. Work with me on it. In particular, if you find yourself saying, this is impossible, it's not going to work, this is so far-fetched, who comes up with these things, it can't happen here, I actually want you to note that and pause. And I want you to think about why your response is that way. Okay? And so finally, in the discussion period, I'm happy to share examples and other strategies. In 20 minutes, there's only so much we can do. It is important for you to know that the stories that I'm sharing are based on a model called Students as Partners. Now, were any of you at the Peter Felton talk earlier this week? Okay, so this is one of Peter Felton's big things, right? Students as Partners literature. He's a brilliant scholar, has contributed in really great ways. So I'm using the same model. The same model sort of informs the experience of what it is that I'm talking about. So if you have any questions about the model, if you have any questions about how I've tried to use the values in the model in my own practices, I'm more than happy to share that with you. I can also give you some really groovy examples, and your educational developers will also be able to access that really fantastic information. So here are the stories. This is one of my favorite cartoons. It's from Punch Magazine. It's not cited, and I apologize. That's terrible of me. But I don't know if you can read it. It says in the bottom, the Committee on Women's Rights will now come to order. Of course, it's a committee of all men. And it actually makes me think and reminds me of a time sitting around. In my life as director, we reported to the provost, and so as deans and directors would have our meetings. And someone was scratching their head about, why are students enrolling for this? Or why are they doing that? Blah, blah, blah. And it just became this sort of blah, blah, blah fest. And at one point I put my hand up and I'm like, why don't we ask them? Why don't we ask the students? If we actually want evidence-based research in our teaching and learning, not just in our research, why don't we ask them? And when I left my job at UNBC, my admin job, the provost said, I always really appreciated that Heather would always remind us about the students. And, I was trying to be gracious, but I really did walk away and do a bit of a facepalm because, frankly, I shouldn't have to remind people in a university to think about the students. There's something wrong if somehow that is my legacy, right? That's a problem. So if you want to know about students' diverse needs, you need to ask the students. You can do it in your classroom. There's all sorts of techniques you can use for your classroom. You can do it in your curriculum design. There's all sorts of models for student inclusion and curriculum design and redesign. In your teaching and learning, again, all sorts of strategies to bring students into educational development in a variety of ways. In governance, there's models and Students as Partners models to include students in governance in way more robust ways than a percentage of seats on a Senate. In research, so one of the prime examples is undergraduate research experiences, which I was Googling, and I know you have that here at Carleton. That is high impact, that is powerful, but are the students research assistants or are they partners? The outcomes of their learning are fundamentally different. And in student affairs programming. So I've always found it interesting that student affairs programming was often created without actually including students in the programming. And So you might get feedback from them, but the students weren't always included. So again, there's all sorts of models. So when we want to ask, when we want to know about the diverse needs of students, we actually have to ask them. Don't make them the other and don't speak on their behalf. Now, here's the thing. If you actually start asking students about their needs, you better be prepared to listen actively and get uncomfortable. So I'm going to tell you a story. David Hornsby knows this one. And it is a deeply uncomfortable story for me. So this is my colleague, co-author, co-researcher, Yathnow. She is a Haida woman. We just finished some work together for BC Campus on students as partners, if anybody's interested, with 2 other partners. And Yathnow used to work for me at our Center for Teaching and Learning at UNBC. And as is the way we do it at universities, right? We want to have conversations about indigenizing the curriculum. So I'm like, well, if I use the students as partners model, I need to bring in my partner, which will be Yathnow, and we need to create this. So as one does, put on my little director's hat, and keep in mind she's also an employee and a student. So there's all sorts of power imbalances going on here. So I bring her in and I'm like, I've got all these ideas and we should do this and we should do that and we should do this and invite this faculty member and do this and do that. And on a side note, I will say, I'm not unfamiliar with the large volume of literature on indigenizing curriculum, on, yeah, we'll just leave it at that. However, in that moment, she looked at me and she said, yeah, you kind of have it all wrong. I'm like, what do you mean? She said, well, if we're actually going to do this properly, and if you actually want me to lead it, then we're not going to use indigenization. Because as a Haida woman, I do not need to be indigenized. And we're going to make sure we include elders. And we're going to do it based on my timeline and my practices. Now, this is pretty amazing, right? She is in a very vulnerable position, but we had luckily had a lot of trust. And she said, you know, and we've written about this, and it's a piece that's forthcoming. And she said, going through her head, you know, she thought about how settlers, of which I am one, use decolonization as a metaphor, and that you actually can't use it as a metaphor. This is Tuck and Yang make that argument. And she also thought about my own, you know, my white fragility, and she's like, I'm just going for it. I'm just going to say this. So the implication of this conversation was profound. And what happened was, I'm like, just do it. But for me personally, as someone who sees myself as a feminist scholar, who thinks I'm engaged and who I pay attention to things, it was a profound reminder of the colonial practices which I carry in my everyday. That we can talk about room naming, but unless we actually are mindful that there's actually fundamental cultural differences and fundamental ways of knowing that are different, our Indigenous students become assimilated, right? So I'm like, oh, this was profoundly difficult for me. I had seen myself as an ally, but it was very clear that I was being colonial in my practices, that I was making assumptions about voice. And so that was highly problematic. The good news is, and there is good news, I'm just checking my time here. The good news is that Yathnow led and created an amazing speaker series. And I'd say we're 80% elders. When they weren't elders, the settlers were working in alliance with the elder. And because numbers count, dissenters of teaching and learning, I will say that the attendance numbers were the highest we'd had for some of our workshops. And so the learning for me was really off the charts. But I was deeply uncomfortable with my own complicity. And I don't know how we unpack that. But if we actually start listening to learners, there are going to be moments that are deeply uncomfortable because we're going to have to, as faculty members, challenge our own privilege, our own hierarchy, our own assumptions about who knows, and our own assumptions about what knowledge is valued. So if you really want to listen, be prepared, because change can't happen if we don't all change. The other thing I just want to share is another story about if we are actually going to authentically engage students as opposed to superficially engage students, authentically give them spaces where they have a voice, authentically have spaces where they can safely express their needs. And safely is key here. So maybe we can use some survey tools, but that might get you some access points. But the other thing is that you have to remember that student safety and trust is key when you're actually trying to get at a sense of what needs are. Because an expression of our needs can feel dangerous at times. So this cluster, there's a better word for it, but it's just gone out of my head, is from this project that I did with Yathnow and 2 other students for BC Campus. And it was based on this idea that there are multiple sites of power in the way we interact with students. I am a political scientist, so that's sort of the way we go. And when we work with students, we underestimate their understanding of sites of power. So we say things like, well, the students don't engage, or I really don't get an idea of what's going on. Well, guess what? Sometimes we set up systems of hierarchy and power and authority that in turn silence students. So, you know, one of the big things out of here is tokenism. And I ran into this again. I'm telling you all the stories that make me very sad. Anyways, I ran into this again where, you know, again, another big idea. Oh, I'm going to do students as partners as a conference theme. I'm going to have students be part of the welcome. And while I'd had student employees for years at my Center for Teaching and Learning, I had never previously included them as part of the welcome. So they actually called me out about engaging in tokenistic behavior. So why weren't we good enough to be involved before, and why aren't we good enough to be involved later? Again, here I am thinking I'm doing this great thing, and in some ways it's not a bad thing that I did, but there's an attentiveness to power and process and sustainability and student voice that students have that we actually often disregard and we underestimate. And so one of the things that's really important is that when we are thinking about students and trying to assess their needs and get feedback on their needs, is that there also have to be sustainable practices, right? How do we include students over time? There's also some new literature that indicates that the students actually need to know what you did with the feedback, right? So not just in the classroom, that's pretty standard. If you ask for feedback from someone, you actually have to tell them what you did with feedback. But in students as partners projects and any kind of consultations, people need to know what you've done with the feedback. Otherwise, it feels like it's going into a vacuum. So if we're going to build inclusive and diverse spaces, they need to be sustainable. And sometimes this costs money. I will say, sometimes this costs money. So my challenge to you is, what are you going to do about it? As staff, one student, faculty, and administrators. Often these processes, for those of us who are embedded in the university culture, don't feel risky. But I think if you're actually going to engage in fundamental change, and if you're actually going to be able to tap into the diverse needs of students in an authentic way, we have to be willing to be the learners, to acknowledge that we're learners, and we need to be able to take risks. Reminds me of I was working with some folks planning curriculum across 5 classes. Believe it or not, it was kind of crazy. And A senior colleague of mine, wonderful teacher, said, yeah, no, I can't do that. And I just looked at him, I said, but we're asking to do this, the students to do all this innovative teaching and learning. Where are we in the process? So, where are the students and where are we? And it does matter. How we engage students, how we position ourselves, our willingness to take risks does matter. Because, as one of my favorite authors tells us, through our everyday practices, we become complicit in the creation of margins, silences, and bottom rungs. So my challenge to you is in the questions that you're posing is, are you complicit in the creations of silences, margins, and bottom rungs? Or are you opening it up for those voices to be heard in authentic and sustainable ways? Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. I'm happy to be here today as a two-time alumnus of Carleton and as the father of a prospective undergrad student who's applying for the fall. So I have a vested interest, I think, in student success here, and almost as much maybe as at my own institution. I want to talk in the next 20 minutes or so, and I'll stress the "and so." I've got a lot to say. I'm going to do it as fast as I can. About what we know about this particular generation of students and what makes them unique relative to previous generations of students that we've encountered. So I've been doing research on generational differences since I was a PhD student here. I won't say how many years ago, it was a number. And so we've gotten the opportunity to see more than two generations move through the university cycle. And the generation that we're dealing with right now, we have lots of names that they've been given. We could call Generation Z. That's the current name that they are being given by the media. It may not stick. It's not very catchy, but it's the one that's being currently used. We're talking about the people who are roughly born in the late part of the 1990s up till about 2010. So how do we know? Well, we know when we know, and we have to track trends and behavioral and emotional trends that we see in our research, and then go back and find out when these trends started. So there's starting to be a growing consensus that about the mid-1990s when we stopped seeing millennials. You're thinking of young people as millennials. They're not the young people we see in our classrooms today, and started to see this new generation. And there are some significant differences between these two groups. So we're talking about the people who started entering universities about 2012, who will probably continue to enter as undergraduate students through about 2028, but who are also now moving into graduate studies. And so for the foreseeable future will be the group of people that we're dealing with. So I have to talk in generalities about these groups in the short time I have, and we have to remember there's a lot of nuance, and these are generalizations. But there are four things that we know about this group that I want to share with you today that make them, I think, somewhat of a challenge, but also provide some opportunities for us as we seek to provide services for them and educational opportunities for them on campuses. The first is that relative to previous generations, they are slow to grow, so to speak. So if we look at the traditional markers of what we constitute as adulthood, getting married and moving out of your parents' house and all of those things that have traditionally been the indicators of what we consider to be an adult, they're happening a lot later these days than they used to. So if you look at first-year students and you think, I don't think I was like that when I was their age, it's not just an illusion of age. We have some good evidence to suggest that that's actually true for a number of reasons. So I don't know if you could see this, but when we look at the census data from 2016, we see that the majority of people age 20 to 24 still live at home with their parents, 63%. 28% of people aged 25 to 29 still live with their parents, and 14% of people in their early 30s still live at home with their parents. In Ontario, it's about 42% of people in their 20s and early 30s who still live at home with their parents, and that's up 20% since 2001. So people are staying at home longer for a number of reasons. It takes a lot longer to get established these days in your career, in your life, because things are complex, and the labor market's complex. People are needing longer periods of education. We also see that markers like the age of a first marriage and age of women giving birth to a first child has increased significantly to historic highs. For women in particular having children, the first child is coming on average at age 29 now versus 24 in the mid-60s. And that's a significant, 5 years is a big span if we think about the period of time in which women can have children. So one of the preeminent researchers on generational issues, whose name is Jean Twenge, who is at San Diego State University, who's written a number of popular books, but also has really defined how we study generations, did something really interesting. She looked at grade 12 cohorts across the United States from the 1970s until present day. So one of the challenges we face in studying generations is if we go out to do a survey now, we're measuring older people and younger people, and we're catching them at two different stages of their lives. She's controlling for age and comparing apples to apples. And what she's found with the latest cohort is that they have reached historic lows in terms of the percentage of times that they go out each week without their parents. And I can tell you, my kids almost never leave the house without us. It's a bit of a problem at times. And the percentage who ever go out on dates, who are sexually active, who drink alcohol, who have a driver's license, and who have a part-time job are at the lowest ever for 18-year-olds since they started recording this. So it's good that they're not drinking and driving, drinking or driving for that matter. But those are some of the things that you expect young people to traditionally do in high school that are sort of low-risk efforts, things that they do that are part of that experience. And now they're coming to university without having had those experiences to a much more frequent degree. So Twenge, in an article she wrote in The Atlantic in 2017, concluded that across a range of behaviors, 18-year-olds are now more like 15-year-olds used to be, and 15-year-olds are more like 13-year-olds. Childhood now stretches well into high school. And we also know that adolescence is now stretching into adulthood. We have a whole new term for the period of life in the 20s. We used to assume that you made the transition from adolescence to adulthood around age 18. Now we have the term emerging adulthood to refer to this period of extended transition into full adulthood. People take longer to launch, to hatch as full-grown adults. And I started to notice on campus a number of years ago that my students referred to themselves and to each other as kids, which I thought was odd at the time, but now it doesn't seem odd at all. It just seems like a term we've become quite accustomed to. A second thing I wanted to discuss is I think maybe the biggest formative influence for this group, or one of the biggest, is their connectedness on social media. So the millennial group was the first to encounter social media, Facebook at the time, but then the other social media outlets. But for this particular generation, having social media available to you at all times wherever you are because of smartphones is really the unique combination that has formed quite a lot of their reality. So this picture here, I've been in classes that look like this. When I asked students to work together in a group, they were all staring at their devices. And I go over and mill around, and I realize that they're actually working together without speaking directly. They'll laugh and look at each other knowingly because they've sent each other a message or because they're editing the same document. But this is what face-to-face collaboration sometimes looks like. So, in fact, as Jean Twenge was doing her research, she became so concerned about some of the influences that she saw related to social media connectedness that she's become sort of a crusader for putting in place policies to help students become inoculated from some of the worst effects of pervasive social media. And she makes a case in her research based on the nascent research that's out there to some of the effects that we're seeing. Okay, we really don't have a grasp. Unfortunately, the technology has advanced far more quickly than our knowledge of its impacts. But what we see is that students, young people, are spending more time alone indoors than they did in previous generations as teenagers. We're seeing a loss of social communication skills. We often hear this from employers, that young people don't make eye contact, they're not great at having simple conversation anymore. There was an ingenious study that was done with kids who were going to a summer camp who had their phones taken away for 2 weeks. And they measured their social communication skills before and after the 2 weeks and saw a marked increase in just that 2 weeks in their ability to talk to one another. So we all are guilty of avoiding and deflecting and using social media as a distraction. But for people who have always had that, it becomes a very embedded way of doing things. We also are seeing shrinking perceptions of time. So there's this irony. When we're online, we lose track of time, but also our perceptions of what constitutes a long time have increased, or decreased. So I remember when TED Talks came out, I thought, this is great. You get so much information in this short period of time. And now I think, who could sit through 18 minutes of this? So I go on YouTube and set the speed to 1.5 so that I can hear them a lot faster. So we're all in this mode of having shrinking attention spans. Also, we see social media giving people distorted views of their social comparators. We used to just post pictures on social media, but now people curate pictures on social media. We use filters, and we take hundreds of pictures and choose the one that best represents us. So the news feed that you get, or the feed that you get of your friends' activities, is not real. It is social media mediated. And I liked what the de-aging filter did for me on Instagram, but if I would have posted that, I think some of my friends would have said, that's not you. You don't look like that. That's not your day-to-day. And we also have the risk of leaving a digital footprint, which is a difficult challenge. We see in every election cycle when somebody is disqualified from running because of something they said on Twitter 15 years ago. So those challenges in the classroom mean that we have people who are distracted, who have the social media there. It's sitting there, and it becomes a distraction by just being there, and their attention spans are shorter. All of our attention spans are shorter, and if we don't change the way that we engage, we're not connecting authentically with the way people actually live these days. All right, let's talk about the parents for a minute. Now, I used to give talks, and I had a couple stories that I suspected at the time were urban myths about parents being over-involved in their adult children's lives, but they're not funny anecdotes anymore. Everybody's got some stories like this, and the number of stories that I hear on campus about parents being highly involved, intrusively involved, I would say, in their adult children's lives are growing. Parents are highly involved for two reasons. First of all, they have the means to be highly involved these days. We have a group of parents who are the most educated parents we've ever had as a broad social statement in society, but also children who are perhaps, because of their slow development, more needy in terms of that parental involvement. So it's sort of a perfect storm for codependency between helicopter parents and those kids. So I use the term helicopter parents, and you might think, well, that's just one of those buzzwords in the media. But I worked with a researcher who's now at the University of Lethbridge who did his doctoral work with me on helicopter parenting as a form of over-involved parenting and its implications for adults. And what he found in his research is, first of all, we know that the incidence of over-involved parenting in adults, reported by adults, people we would consider adults who are over 18, has increased significantly over the years. But the consequences of having over-involved parents, helicopter parents are micromanaging parents, but who do it with warmth, not detachment. Having those micromanaging parents with good intentions, it causes a couple problems. It leads to insecure attachments in adults, which later can present with difficulties in relationships. It also leads to foreclosure in identity formation. So we see young people who pick a career, who decide what they're going to do, and then later face an identity crisis because they chose that option, they chose that major, that path, not because they explored and came to the conclusion that it was right for them, but because working with their parents, they quickly decided that that was where they should go. So I engage with my students by teaching a first-year seminar course, and I have my students journal, and sometimes they say things that are telling to me, and I ask for permission to share. And one of my students wrote this quote in her journal, and she said I could share this. She said, "My parents are involved in all my university decisions. I always tend to feel that if I fail, I disappoint them, that if I don't do good in school or get good grades, I'm making them pay a huge amount of money for nothing." And we had a big discussion about the role of parents and the anxiety that students feel because of their parents' involvement as a whole week in my first year seminar course. And there was a lot of identification with this issue amongst the students. So for people starting university now, I mean, for many of us who are older, I may have been the first generation of people to go to university in our families. For a growing number of students, that's not the case. And they feel as if when they're making university decisions, when they're performing at school, they're not just doing it for them, they're doing it for a team, and if they fail, they let down the team. So parents are important. They're an important influencer. This is a graphic from a study done by the Randstad group in the US, and actually was looking at some data just an hour ago with my long-term research colleague and former classmate, Dr. Linda Schweitzer, who brought her generation of student offspring with her too. I'm going to tell stories about you as a helicopter parent. We're going to get to that point. And we have independent verification of the... we see that parents are much more likely than, even for Gen Y, to be the primary influencer of young people's career decisions, more so than friends, managers, and co-workers. So the parents matter. We can't avoid the parents anymore. They're an important part of young people's lives, and the consequences of that involvement is something we need to consider as we work with students. The next piece the fourth and final thing I wanted to mention, I think, is maybe the most important for us. I think that it's probably not a surprise if I say that we're having a concerning crisis on campuses of mental health issues. We have a very anxious group of students, and there's lots of evidence to support this. So this image is obviously it's a snowflake, and we used to use this term snowflake to talk about millennials as a pejorative, to say they all think they're snowflakes, they're unique and they're one of a kind and everything about them is special. But in recent years, the term snowflake has been used as a pejorative to describe young people who are fragile, whose egos are so fragile that they're evanescent, that they can't survive in the environment that they're in. And it's a bit of a hurtful pejorative, as many are, because there's a lot of evidence to suggest that this is a real problem. So I've got a couple statistics slides here for you from the National College Health Assessment. This is a big nationwide Canadian sample. They do it in the US every year and in Canada every 3 years. And we see from this, I only took the things that were from the majority of students. We see that 88% of students over the past 12 years reported being overwhelmed by all they had to do. 88% were exhausted emotionally. Large majority said they were very sad, very lonely. 70% said they were overwhelmingly anxious. 64% said that things had felt hopeless for them in the past 12 months. And 52% had said that they were so depressed that it was hard to function. And if we look just at the percentage points increases since 2013, in only a 6-year period, there have been big increases, a 14 percentage point increase in the in the proportion of students who said that they were so depressed that it was hard to function in the past year. That's a huge change in a short period of time, a very alarming one that we're seeing on campuses. We also see that almost a quarter of students are currently being treated for anxiety, according to their self-reports. About a fifth are being treated for depression, 16% being treated for both. We have 16% who have seriously considered suicide, 10% who have intentionally self-injured, and about 3% who have attempted suicide. And all of these things have increased markedly since 2013. If you look at the suicide attempts, it's gone up from 1.5% to 3%. So still, it's a relatively small number, but that's almost a doubling of the proportion of people reporting that. And one suicide is too many. That's very alarming. So if Carleton is like the University of Guelph, and I suspect it is, this is putting a big strain on the services that we provide to students. In my university, over the past 10 years, we've seen a steady increase in the demand for counseling services. We've seen a 170% increase in the use of student accessibility services. And almost all of that increase, including a 100% increase in the demand for exam accommodations, has been not related to learning disabilities or physical disabilities, which have been stable. Almost all of that, almost exponential growth in that demand has come from mental health demands. So we have a group of students who are much more comfortable asking for help, which is a positive thing, but in need of a level of service that we're having a difficult time providing to dire consequences. We also see students dealing with a number of career-related issues that we have to accommodate as we try to prepare them for their careers. So I've done research with students and young adults who are in the labor force, but also with guidance counselors, Ontario's guidance counselors in the last few years. So we asked the guidance counselors to talk about the students' strengths in various areas. And what was telling to me is that they were so low, they reported so few things as strengths, that it's more interesting for me to report to you the deficits. So these are the things that the guidance counselors reported as the bottom two scale points, as either being very little a strength or not at all a strength for the high school students that they're preparing for university. Resilience, independent decision making, flexibility and adaptability in their career plans, mental health, self-care, and recognizing their career options. When we ask students about what their career concerns are, they revolve around financial security, the affordability of life, the ability to potentially own a home in the future, saving for the future, and then finding a job, and in particular finding a job related to your major. So we see financial security concerns, and we see concerns about employability. And those are creating a great deal of anxiety in young people based on some of the research that we've done and continue to do. We asked both groups, about their beliefs about the labor market, and the majority of both groups, the guidance counselors and the students, say that they believe that post-secondary education no longer guarantees employment, that young people are in precarious work situations these days after they graduate, that the labor force is more competitive than it was in the past, and it's harder for young people to find work in their field. And they also both believe that young people need high specialization in their education in order to find good jobs. And they were split on one thing. The students tended to believe strongly that there are fewer and fewer good jobs these days, whereas the guidance counselors who were more informed about labor market data were less likely to agree. Only 40% of them agreed. So we see these pressures in young people. They're staring down an economy. They're being constantly told that it's difficult for them to get established. And they approach their career through their education with that in mind. So we asked, are universities doing a good job in preparing people for the future? And the students only about a third said yes. But then we see that they're demanding, in majority, more focus on job skills rather than concepts, and more focus on business skills like communication and professionalism. So while we may, as educators, hold the line for the kind of liberal arts education that we see as beneficial, and the critical thinking skills and the content that we think is absolutely necessary for students to thrive, that universities are built on, they're looking for job readiness skills. So there's a bit of a mismatch, I think, in that particular set of expectations. So to sum that up, we have young people who are here still forming their identities, very much so, while they're on campus. They're relying more and more on their parents, but also on external guidance and support. They're very worried about their futures, and they lack the resources that they need to become more adaptive and resilient, and they're looking for more help where that's concerned. So what do we do? How do we respond? There's the call to arms. Okay, boomer, what are you going to do about this? I will quickly say some of the things that we need to think about are the messages that we send in the way that we speak to students, in the way that we communicate, in the way that we teach, in the programming and the services that we provide. I think because we are pushed to be market driven, we listen to the needs of parents and to the demands of the students, and we try to reflect those things, but we also need to be mindful of some of the problems that we're seeing and what we can do to counter them. I'd say the first thing we need to do is let young people know that it's not a race. They're telling us that they're taking longer to form their identities and move towards careers, and we need to listen and let them know that's okay. It's okay to explore. It's okay to not be highly specialized, to be undeclared for time, take different courses, try different options. When I see a student enrolling in a highly specialized degree program with a specialization within it at age 17, I want to say to them, you're making decisions now. Your 17-year-old self is making decisions now about your career that you're going to be living with for a long time. I don't know about you, but my 17-year-old self was not my mentor. It would not be a wise person for me to take advice from. I needed to grow at that point. So having to make important decisions at that point without having the freedom to explore and try new things is a bit perilous. So we have to try to give them more space to explore. It's also important, I think, to let people know that, the future is not something that we have ultimate control over. We have control over the here and now. Focus on the present. That anxiety comes from this sense of not knowing what the future is going to look like. None of us know what the future is going to look like. But if we can be prepared with adaptability and resilience, it won't matter what the future is going to look like. And that's where we have to be. We need them to encourage to take more risks and understand that failing is an option. That you can fail and get up and be better for it, because that's how you build resilience, by taking small risks, managed risks, reasonable risks. By seeing that you can fail, pick yourself up and move on, and then indemnify yourself to those effects of failure on your psyche. One of the messages that I work towards throughout the whole semester with my first-year seminar students is to get them comfortable with the idea that it's okay to disagree with your parents. That your job over the next 4 years is to become independent. And if your parents don't like what you're doing, it's okay. That's fine. This is your life. This is your career. You have to have a conversation about these things with them, but you get to be in charge. And that's not an easy conversation to have. There's a lot of resistance on their part to that conversation. It takes quite a bit of work to get them to broach that. And again, always be working on adaptability and resilience. And I'll leave you with an image. This is an image that, based on all the work that we've been doing, Linda and I like to show to everyone who will listen, including all of the students that we speak to say that a career is not a path. It's not a ladder. It's not a pathway that we set out for you. There is no clear lights in the aisleway showing you where the exits are. A career, based on all the research we've done and the hundreds of interviews that we've done with people who have lived their careers, is more like crossing a stream on slippery rocks. You have to step one rock at a time. You have to be focused on the rock that you're standing on and the one that you're going to step on next. But you know where you're going. You're going across the river and you have a rough idea where you want to end up. But it's all about adaptation and making choices based on where you stand right now. And when you take another step, reevaluating based on the new perspective that that new rock gives you. And sometimes it's slippery and you have to step back, and sometimes you have to go sideways, but that's all part of that journey. And based on all of the work we've done, that's what people's careers tend to look like. If we think about our own careers, how many of us walked a linear path right to where we are today? I certainly didn't. Thank you.